How was London in 1810? A comprehensive historical overview. Chapter 1. The Physical City. Streets, Buildings, and the Thames. The metropolis of the world. In 1810, London stood as the largest and most powerful city on Earth. With a population approaching 1 million souls, it dwarfed every other city in the Western world. Paris, its nearest European rival, held only half as many inhabitants. London was the beating heart of the British Empire, the center of global commerce, and a city of staggering contrasts between wealth and poverty, elegance and squalor, progress and tradition. The city spread across both banks of the River Thames, though the north bank contained most of the significant development. The ancient city of London, the original walled settlement dating to Roman times, remained the commercial and financial heart. Westminster, a mile to the west, housed Parliament, the royal palaces, and the machinery of government. Between and around these two centers, London had sprawled outward in every direction, absorbing villages and creating new neighborhoods that together formed the great metropolis. The boundaries of London were imprecise. The city had no single governing authority, no clear edge where it ended and the countryside began. Built-up areas extended from Limehouse in the east to Kensington in the west, from Islington in the north to Southwark across the river. Beyond these areas, villages like Hampstead, Hackney, and Camberwell remained separate communities, though London's relentless growth would eventually swallow them all. The River Thames. The River Thames was London's reason for existence, and remained its most important feature. This great tidal river connected London to the sea and thus to the entire world. The Pool of London, the stretch of river below London Bridge, was the busiest port on the planet, crowded with vessels of every size and description. Hundreds of ships lay at anchor in the river at any given time. Great East Indiamen returned from China and India, laden with tea, silk, spices, and porcelain. West India ships brought sugar, rum, and coffee from Caribbean plantations. Colliers from Newcastle delivered the coal that heated London's homes and powered its industries. Smaller vessels carried goods up and down the coast of Britain and across the Channel to Europe. The river was so crowded that ships often waited weeks for space at the limited wharves. Lightermen in small boats ferried cargo between ships and shore. Watermen rowed passengers across and along the river, providing essential transportation in a city with only 3 bridges. Mudlarks, the poorest of the poor, scavenged in the tidal mud for anything of value dropped or discarded from the ships above. The Thames stank. Raw sewage from 1 million people flowed into it through countless drains. Dead animals floated on its surface. Industrial waste from tanneries, dye works, and slaughterhouses added to the pollution. Yet Londoners continued to draw drinking water from this same river, contributing to the periodic epidemics that swept the city. Bridges and crossings. London Bridge had been the only Thames crossing for centuries, but by 1810, 2 additional bridges served the growing city. Westminster Bridge, completed in 1750, connected Westminster to Lambeth on the south bank. Blackfriars Bridge, opened in 1769, provided another crossing further east. London Bridge itself was still the medieval structure lined with buildings, though these would be removed in the coming years. The bridges were crowded from morning until night. Carts, carriages, horsemen, and pedestrians competed for space on the narrow roadways. Tolls were charged on the newer bridges, making them less accessible to the poor. Many Londoners still relied on watermen to ferry them across, paying a penny or two for passage in small rowing boats that darted between the larger vessels. Streets and roads. The streets of 1810 London ranged from elegant thoroughfares to narrow, dangerous alleys. The contrast was extreme and often jarring, with fashionable streets adjacent to some of the worst slums in Europe. The West End contained the finest streets. Mayfair, developed over the previous century, featured elegant squares surrounded by uniform brick townhouses. Grosvenor Square, Berkeley Square, and Hanover Square were addresses of the highest prestige, home to aristocrats and the wealthiest merchants. The houses were built in the Georgian style, with symmetrical facades, sash windows, and classical proportions. Piccadilly, Bond Street, and Oxford Street were becoming fashionable shopping destinations. Here, merchants displayed luxury goods behind large glass windows, a relatively new innovation that turned shopping into a form of entertainment. Jewelers, milliners, booksellers, and purveyors of fine goods competed for the custom of the wealthy. The Strand connected Westminster to the city, lined with shops, coffee houses, and the townhouses of the nobility. Fleet Street was the center of the printing trade, home to newspapers, publishers, and booksellers. Cheapside in the city was a major commercial street, though the medieval street pattern made it narrow and congested. In stark contrast, the poorer districts featured streets that were narrow, dark, and dangerous. The rookeries of St. Giles, Seven Dials, and Saffron Hill were notorious slums where thousands lived in unimaginable squalor. Streets in these areas were unpaved, filled with refuse, and rarely penetrated by the authorities. Crime flourished, and outsiders entered at their peril. Street paving varied dramatically by location. The main thoroughfares were paved with cobblestones or granite setts, though maintenance was inconsistent. Side streets might be paved, unpaved, or partially paved. Mud was a constant problem in wet weather, while dust choked pedestrians when it was dry. Crossing sweepers, often young boys, earned pennies by sweeping paths through the muck for pedestrians. Buildings and architecture. The architectural character of 1810 London was predominantly Georgian, with its emphasis on proportion, symmetry, and classical details. Red brick was the most common building material, though stucco was becoming fashionable for grander structures. Portland stone faced the most important public buildings. St. Paul's Cathedral, completed by Christopher Wren in 1710, dominated the skyline as it had for a century. Its great dome rose above the surrounding buildings, visible from miles away and serving as a landmark for travelers approaching the city. The churches Wren had built after the Great Fire of 1666 still punctuated the cityscape with their distinctive steeples. The Palace of Westminster, where Parliament met, was a rambling complex of medieval and later buildings. The original medieval hall, built by William Rufus and rebuilt by Richard II, still stood and hosted the great law courts. The Houses of Lords and Commons met in converted chapel spaces that were increasingly inadequate for a growing legislature. The Tower of London remained a royal fortress, armory, and prison. Its medieval walls and towers evoked centuries of English history, including some of its darkest chapters. The crown jewels were displayed there, and the Tower Menagerie housed exotic animals for public viewing. Residential architecture reflected social standing with precision. Aristocratic townhouses might occupy an entire building around a fashionable square. Upper-middle-class families lived in terraced houses with several floors, keeping servants in basement kitchens and attic bedrooms. Lower-middle-class families might occupy part of a house, sharing with other tenants. The poor crowded into single rooms in subdivided buildings, with entire families living in spaces meant for one person. Gas lighting. A remarkable innovation was just beginning to transform London's nights. In 1807, Pall Mall had become the first street in the world to be illuminated by gaslight. The Gaslight and Coke Company, founded in 1812, would soon expand this system throughout the city, but in 1810, gaslighting remained a novelty visible only in a few locations. Most of London relied on traditional lighting. Oil lamps on poles illuminated major streets, though their light was dim and their coverage inconsistent. Link boys carried torches to guide pedestrians through dark streets, earning tips for their service. Wealthy households used candles and oil lamps, while the poor made do with rushlights or darkness. The darkness of London at night was profound by modern standards. Streets that were busy and relatively safe by day became dangerous after dark. Footpads and robbers lurked in shadows, and wise Londoners avoided unnecessary travel after sunset. Chapter 2: The People. Population, classes, and social structure. 1 million souls. London in 1810 contained approximately 950,000 to 1 million inhabitants, making it the first city in modern history to reach such a population. This represented dramatic growth from the 675,000 counted in 1750, and the city would continue to grow explosively throughout the 19th century. This vast population was packed into an area of perhaps 30 square miles, creating densities that strained every system of sanitation, supply, and social order. The poorest districts were among the most densely populated places on Earth, with families crowded into cellars, attics, and subdivided rooms in conditions that bred disease and desperation. The population was constantly churning. Londoners died at rates exceeding births. Only constant immigration from the countryside maintained and grew the population. Young people from every county in England came seeking opportunity, escaping rural poverty, or simply drawn by the excitement of the great city. Many died within years of arrival. Others prospered and established themselves, most simply survived, adding their labor to the urban economy. The aristocracy. At the apex of London's society stood the aristocracy, a small group of perhaps a few hundred families who wielded enormous power and enjoyed vast wealth. These were the dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons who held hereditary titles and seats in the House of Lords. Aristocratic families maintained grand townhouses in the West End, particularly around Mayfair and St. James's. These houses were staffed by dozens of servants and furnished with old master paintings, fine furniture, and every luxury. During the social season, from late winter through early summer, aristocratic families gathered in London for a whirlwind of balls, dinners, receptions, and political intrigue. The Prince of Wales, the future George IV, set the tone for fashionable society. His extravagance, his mistresses, and his quarrel with his father the king were constant topics of gossip. Carlton House, his London residence, was a showcase of opulent decoration and fashionable entertainment. Aristocratic power rested on land. Great families owned vast estates in the countryside, generating income from rents that supported their London lifestyle. Political power flowed from this economic base. Aristocrats controlled the parliamentary seats, appointed clergy to church livings, and influenced every aspect of national life. The gentry and upper middle class. Below the aristocracy, but above the common people, stood the gentry and upper middle class. This diverse group included wealthy merchants, bankers, successful lawyers, senior clergymen, and members of parliament without noble titles. They aspired to aristocratic manners while making their money through commerce and the professions. The upper middle class lived well, occupying comfortable townhouses in respectable neighborhoods. They kept servants, educated their sons at public schools and universities, and sought to marry their daughters advantageously. Social climbing was a constant preoccupation, with families seeking connections to the aristocracy through marriage, business, or patronage. Merchants, who had made fortunes in trade, might purchase country estates and hope their grandsons would be taken for gentlemen. Successful lawyers might earn knighthoods and see their families rise in status. The boundaries of this class were fluid, with money providing entry and lack of money ensuring exclusion. The middle classes. The broader middle class encompassed a wide range of occupations and incomes. Shopkeepers, clerks, minor professionals, skilled craftsmen who had risen to become masters, and others of middling status filled this category. They were respectable without being wealthy, comfortable without being secure. Middle-class families might keep one or two servants, live in modest but decent housing, and educate their children to follow similar occupations. They valued respectability highly, distinguishing themselves from the working poor through dress, manners, and moral conduct. Church attendance, sobriety, and domestic virtue marked middle-class identity. This class was growing as the economy developed. New occupations in commerce, administration, and the professions created opportunities for advancement, yet insecurity haunted middle-class life. Illness, business failure, or simple bad luck could plunge a family into poverty. The working classes. The great majority of Londoners belonged to the working classes, earning their bread through manual labor, domestic service, or trades. This was an enormously diverse category, ranging from skilled artisans earning good wages to unskilled laborers barely surviving. Skilled trades included printing, furniture making, tailoring, shoemaking, and dozens of other crafts. These workers might earn respectable wages and maintain some independence, though they remained vulnerable to economic downturns. Many trades were organized through guilds or informal associations that regulated entry and maintained standards. Domestic service employed vast numbers, particularly women. Great houses might employ dozens of servants in a strict hierarchy, from butler and housekeeper down to scullery maids and kitchen boys. Middle-class households might keep a single maid of all work, who performed every domestic task. Service provided food and shelter, but little freedom. Servants were at their employer's beck and call at all hours. Factory work was growing as the Industrial Revolution progressed, though London's manufacturing remained largely in small workshops, rather than large factories. Textile finishing, brewing, sugar refining, and metalworking employed thousands. Conditions were often brutal, with long hours, dangerous equipment, and minimal pay. The docks employed thousands of men in loading and unloading ships. This work was casual and irregular. Men gathered each morning hoping to be selected for a day's labor. Competition was fierce, and many days brought no work at all. Dock workers lived in the crowded neighborhoods of the East End, always on the edge of destitution. The poor and destitute. At the bottom of London's society were the truly poor, those who could not find regular work, the disabled, the elderly without family support, orphaned children, and the masses who lived by expedients that ranged from begging to theft. The rookeries of St. Giles, Seven Dials, and similar areas housed thousands in conditions of appalling squalor. Entire families lived in single rooms, without sanitation or clean water. Buildings that should have housed one family were subdivided to hold 10. Cellars served as dwellings, dark and damp, breeding grounds for disease. Poverty was visible everywhere in London. Beggars lined the streets, displaying their misery to elicit coins from passers-by. Street children survived by theft, scavenging, or whatever work they could find. Prostitution was rampant, with thousands of women and girls selling their bodies for survival. The parish workhouse provided minimal support for the destitute, but conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage dependency. Families were separated, work was required, and the stigma was profound. Many preferred the streets to the workhouse, despite the hardships of outdoor life. Immigrants and minorities. London attracted migrants from throughout the British Isles and beyond. Irish immigrants were numerous, fleeing poverty in Ireland for the opportunities of the great city. They filled the lowest paid jobs as labourers and domestic servants, and faced considerable prejudice from English Londoners. Jewish communities had existed in London since their readmission under Cromwell in the 1650s. By 1810, both Sephardic Jews of Spanish and Portuguese origin and Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe maintained synagogues and businesses. Jews were excluded from many occupations, but found niches in finance, trade, and crafts. A small black population lived in London, including former slaves, servants, and sailors. Some had come during the American Revolution as loyalists. Others had been brought to England by returning colonists. They faced discrimination, but were legally free, slavery being unenforceable on English soil. Chapter 3: Daily Life. Work, Food, and Domestic Existence. The Working Day. Life in 1810. London was governed by natural light to a greater degree than modern people can easily imagine. The working day began at first light and ended at dusk for most occupations. In winter, this might mean only 8 or 9 hours of productive time. In summer, workers might labor for 14 hours or more. Shops typically opened by 7 or 8 in the morning and remained open until late evening, sometimes until 10 at night. Shopkeepers and their assistants worked these entire hours, with little time for meals or rest. Sunday was the only day of rest for most workers, and even then, many worked half the day. Industrial work was often structured around fixed hours rather than daylight. Factory workers might work 12 to 16-hour shifts, with brief breaks for meals. Child workers, some as young as 5 or 6, worked alongside adults in factories and workshops. There were no laws limiting working hours. Such regulations would not come until later in the century. Domestic servants had no fixed hours at all. They were expected to be available whenever needed, from early morning when fires needed the lighting until late night when their employers retired. A servant's life was one of constant work, with only occasional half-days off. Food and meals. The diet of Londoners varied enormously by class, from the elaborate multi-course dinners of the wealthy to the meager fare of the poor. Food quality and quantity were markers of status as clear as any clothing or address. Wealthy households enjoyed abundant and varied food. Breakfast might include eggs, cold meats, bread, and butter. Dinner, the main meal served in early afternoon, could feature multiple courses: soup, fish, roasted meats, vegetables, puddings, and desserts. Supper in the evening was lighter, perhaps cold meats and cheese. Wine, imported from France, Spain, and Portugal, accompanied meals. Middle-class tables were less elaborate but still comfortable. Roasted and boiled meats formed the centerpiece of main meals, accompanied by bread, vegetables, and perhaps a pudding. Tea had become a national necessity, consumed at breakfast and in the afternoon. Beer or porter was the common drink for those who could not afford wine. The working poor ate simply and often inadequately. Bread was the staple food, consumed in enormous quantities. It might be supplemented with cheese, bacon, or vegetables when money allowed. Tea, though expensive, had become common even among the poor, valued for its warmth and energy provided by sugar. Street food provided hot meals for those without kitchens. Pies, baked potatoes, fried fish, and various preparations sold from stalls and carried on heads. The truly destitute ate whatever they could find or afford. Stale bread, scraps begged from kitchens, meat of dubious quality from dubious sources. Malnutrition was common, and hunger was a daily reality for thousands. Food shopping was a daily necessity in an age before refrigeration. Markets throughout the city sold fresh produce, meat, and fish. Smithfield Market was the great meat market, where livestock was driven through the streets for slaughter. Billingsgate was the fish market, reeking of its commodity. Covent Garden sold fruits and vegetables brought from market gardens in the surrounding countryside. Adulteration of food was rampant and largely unregulated. Bread was whitened with alum or chalk. Milk was watered down. Tea was extended with dried leaves from other plants. Beer was adulterated with various substances to give it strength and color. These practices were so common that pure food was almost a luxury. Housing and domestic life. Housing in London ranged from palatial townhouses to cellars barely fit for human habitation. The home one occupied defined one's place in society as clearly as any other marker. Aristocratic townhouses were virtual palaces. They might contain dozens of rooms, drawing rooms for entertaining, dining rooms for formal meals, libraries for study, bedrooms for family and guests, and extensive servants' quarters. Furnishings were often elaborate: silk wallpapers, crystal chandeliers, carpets from Persia, furniture by the finest craftsmen. Upper middle-class homes were smaller, but still comfortable. A typical terraced house might have 4 or 5 floors: basement kitchen and servants' hall, ground floor dining room and parlor, first floor drawing room, and bedrooms above. Such a house might be staffed by 4 or 5 servants: cook, housemaid, parlor maid, and perhaps a manservant. Lower middle-class families might occupy part of a house, renting the upper floors, while the ground floor contained a shop or business. Space was more limited, servants fewer, and furnishings simpler. Keeping up appearances was a constant struggle, as the boundary between respectable poverty and actual destitution was alarmingly thin. Working-class housing was crowded and often inadequate. A family might occupy 2 rooms in a subdivided house, sharing a privy in the yard with several other families. Water came from a pump in the street, carried upstairs in buckets. Cooking was done on small stoves or open fires. Furniture was minimal: beds, a table, a few chairs, perhaps a chest for storage. The poor lived in conditions that reformers would later describe with horror: entire families in single rooms, multiple families in single houses, cellar dwellings without light or ventilation, buildings so decrepit they threatened collapse. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Chamber pots were emptied into the street or into overflowing cesspits. Sanitation and health. London in 1810 was a profoundly unhealthy place. Life expectancy was significantly lower than in the countryside, and infant mortality was horrifyingly high. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. In the poorest districts, the rate was even higher. Sanitation barely existed by modern standards. There was no sewage system. Waste went into cesspits that were periodically emptied by night soil men, or simply into the streets and the river. The Thames was an open sewer, yet many Londoners drew their drinking water from it. Wells were often contaminated by nearby cesspits. Epidemic diseases swept through regularly. Typhus, spread by lice in crowded conditions, was endemic in the poorer districts. Smallpox killed and disfigured thousands, though vaccination was beginning to provide protection. Tuberculosis was rampant, slowly killing its victims over months or years. Cholera had not yet arrived, but other waterborne diseases killed regularly. Medical care was limited and often ineffective. Hospitals existed, but were primarily charitable institutions for the poor. The wealthy were treated at home. Physicians understood little about the causes of disease, and their treatments, bleeding, purging, and dosing with toxic substances like mercury often did more harm than good. Surgery was performed without anesthesia and without understanding of antisepsis. Survival was uncertain even from minor procedures. The miasma theory held that disease was caused by bad air, particularly the foul odors that pervaded the city. While wrong about the mechanism, this theory did encourage efforts to remove filth and improve ventilation. The true causes of most diseases, germs spread by contaminated water, crowded conditions, and insect vectors, would not be understood for decades. Chapter 4: Commerce, Industry, and the Economy. The commercial capital of the world. London in 1810 was the undisputed commercial and financial capital of the world. The British Empire was approaching its zenith, and London was its heart. Money, goods, and information flowed through the city in quantities unmatched anywhere else on Earth. The City of London, the square mile at the ancient heart of the metropolis, concentrated financial and commercial activity to an extraordinary degree. Here were the Bank of England, the great insurance houses, the commodity exchanges, and the offices of merchants trading with every corner of the globe. Fortunes were made and lost within these narrow streets. The wealth generated by trade was transforming London. New buildings rose constantly, streets were improved and extended, and the boundaries of the city pushed outward. Wealth funded grand townhouses, elaborate entertainments, and philanthropic endeavors. It also created stark inequalities, as the prosperity of some contrasted painfully with the poverty of others. The Bank of England. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, occupied its imposing building on Threadneedle Street. This institution was central to British finance, managing the national debt, issuing banknotes, and serving as banker to the government. Its notes were widely accepted as currency, supplementing the limited supply of gold and silver coins. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars had placed enormous strain on the nation's finances. In 1797, the bank had suspended gold payments, meaning its notes could no longer be exchanged for gold on demand. This bank restriction would continue until 1821, and it generated considerable controversy about currency, inflation, and the proper conduct of monetary policy. The bank's directors were powerful figures in the city, and their decisions affected commerce throughout the empire. Credit conditions, interest rates, and the availability of currency could make the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy for merchants and manufacturers alike. The Stock Exchange. The London Stock Exchange had recently moved into new premises in Capel Court. Here, brokers and jobbers traded shares in joint stock companies, government bonds, and other securities. The exchange was a noisy, crowded place where fortunes could change in minutes based on news from the war, from distant markets, or from the government. Trading was dominated by government securities, particularly the consols that funded the national debt. The cost of the war had multiplied the debt, creating an enormous market in these instruments. Insurance company shares, canal company shares, and shares in various commercial enterprises also traded, though the corporate sector was still small by later standards. Speculation was rampant, and critics worried about the moral implications of gambling in shares. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 remained a cautionary memory, though it had not prevented subsequent speculative episodes. Fortunes could be made quickly in the exchange, but they could also be lost, and the profession of stock jobbing carried some social stigma. Insurance and Lloyd's. London was the center of the global insurance industry. Lloyd's of London, growing from a coffee house where merchants gathered to share maritime risks, had become the leading market for ship and cargo insurance. Underwriters at Lloyd's assessed risks and offered policies covering vessels trading to every part of the world. The coffee house had given way to more formal premises, though the business was still conducted by individual underwriters rather than by a corporation. Names at Lloyd's put their personal fortunes behind the risks they accepted, creating a system of mutual guarantee that gave confidence to those seeking insurance. Fire insurance was another major business, with several companies competing to protect London's buildings and their contents. The Sunfire Office, the Royal Exchange Assurance, and others maintained their own fire brigades to protect insured properties, and only insured properties, from flames. The Port of London. The Port of London handled more shipping than any other port in the world. The Pool of London, the stretch of river below London Bridge, was perpetually crowded with vessels. The legal quays along the riverbank could not accommodate the traffic, and ships often waited weeks to unload. The chaos of the open river was beginning to give way to enclosed docks. The West India Docks, opened in 1802, provided secure enclosed basins for ships trading with the Caribbean. The London Docks, opened in 1805, served similar purposes. More docks would follow in the coming decades, transforming the geography of the East End. The port employed tens of thousands. Stevedores loaded and unloaded cargo. Lightermen operated the small boats that transferred goods between ships and shore. Coopers maintained the barrels that held so many commodities. Clerks tallied quantities and checked manifests. Customs officers collected duties on imported goods. The entire economy of the riverside depended on the endless flow of commerce. Manufacturing and industry. London was primarily a commercial rather than an industrial city, but manufacturing was significant nonetheless. The great factories of the Industrial Revolution were mostly in the North and Midlands, but London had its own industrial sector, often organized in smaller workshops rather than large factories. Brewing was a major London industry. Great breweries like Whitbread, Truman, and Barclay Perkins produced vast quantities of porter and ale for the London market and beyond. These were among the largest industrial enterprises anywhere, with complex processes and substantial capital investment. Silk weaving employed thousands in Spitalfields, where Huguenot refugees had established the trade more than a century earlier. The industry was under pressure from cheaper imports and changing fashions, but it remained significant. Weavers worked in their own homes or in small workshops, often in conditions of great poverty. Printing and publishing were centered in Fleet Street and its surroundings. Newspapers, books, pamphlets, and every form of printed matter emerged from London's presses. The Times, the Morning Post, and other newspapers shaped public opinion. Publishers produced works of literature, science, religion, and practical instruction. Other trades included furniture making, clockmaking, jewelry, tailoring, and countless specialized crafts. London's skilled artisans produced goods of high quality for wealthy customers both in Britain and abroad. These crafts often clustered in particular neighborhoods, creating communities of specialized workers. Shops and retail. Shopping was becoming a form of entertainment for those with money to spend. The great shopping streets of the West End displayed luxury goods in increasingly elaborate window displays. Plate glass allowed larger windows. Gas lighting would soon allow evening shopping. The art of retail display was advancing rapidly. Drapers sold fabrics for clothing and household use. Milliners offered fashionable hats and accessories. Jewelers displayed their wares in secure premises. Booksellers and print shops catered to the educated. Haberdashers, glovers, perfumers, and specialists of every kind served the wealthy consumer. For everyday needs, smaller shops and markets served all classes. Bakers, butchers, grocers, and greengrocers supplied households with necessities. Street vendors sold hot and cold food, used clothing, and countless other items. For the poor, pawnbrokers provided crucial credit, lending money against household goods that might or might not be redeemed. Chapter 5. Government, Law, and Order. The Constitution and Parliament. Britain in 1810 was a constitutional monarchy governed under principles established by centuries of precedent and by specific settlements, including the Bill of Rights of 1689. King George III remained the nominal head of state, but his recurrent mental illness, now believed to be porphyria, was increasingly incapacitating him. By 1811, his son would become Prince Regent, giving the era its name. Parliament was the supreme legislative authority, consisting of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The Lords comprised hereditary peers, bishops of the Church of England, and a few other members. The Commons was elected, though by a franchise so limited and corrupted that it bore little resemblance to modern democracy. The electoral system was a notorious tangle of anomalies. Some constituencies, with virtually no inhabitants, returned 2 members to Parliament, while great cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no representation at all. Voting was public, and bribery, treating, and intimidation were common. Perhaps 1 adult male in 10 could vote, and the electorate was heavily weighted toward the wealthy and the landed. Despite its limitations, Parliament was a genuine arena of political conflict. Whigs and Tories contested elections and debated policy. The great issues of the day, the war with France, taxation, relations with Ireland, the beginnings of demands for parliamentary reform, were debated in speeches that could shape public opinion and government action. Local government. London's governance was a chaotic patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions. There was no single authority responsible for the entire metropolis. Instead, various bodies exercised limited powers over portions of the city. The City of London, governed by the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and Common Council, controlled only the ancient square mile. This corporation jealously guarded its privileges and resisted any extension of its authority or any encroachment by outside bodies. The city had its own courts, its own police, and its own traditions dating back centuries. Westminster was governed differently, with authority divided among vestries, improvement commissioners, and other bodies. The surrounding parishes each had their own vestries responsible for poor relief, roads, and other local matters. Coordination was minimal, and responsibilities often fell through the cracks. This fragmented system was increasingly inadequate for a growing city. Streets were badly maintained, sanitation was neglected, and crime flourished in the jurisdictional gaps. Reformers called for unified metropolitan government, but vested interests resisted change. A unified authority would not emerge until later in the century. Law enforcement. Professional policing did not exist in 1810 London. The system of law enforcement was a hodgepodge of ancient institutions barely adapted to modern conditions. Crime was rampant, and the response was often ineffective. The Bow Street Runners, established in 1749, represented the closest thing to a detective force. These men, operating from the Bow Street Magistrates' Court, investigated serious crimes and pursued criminals. But they numbered only a few dozen and could not hope to police the entire metropolis. Parish constables were supposed to maintain order in each parish, but they were often unwilling or unable to do so. The position was unpaid and rotated among householders, who could hire substitutes if they wished to avoid service. The quality of constables varied enormously, and many were ineffective. The watch patrolled streets at night, calling the hours and watching for fires or disturbances. Watchmen were often elderly men earning small wages. They were the butt of jokes and frequently proved useless against determined criminals. Private enterprise filled some gaps. Thief-takers earned rewards for apprehending criminals and recovering stolen property. Some operated legitimately, others were corrupt, working with criminals or even organizing crimes to collect rewards. Henry Fielding's reforms had curbed some abuses, but the system remained problematic. The criminal law and punishment. The criminal law of 1810 was notorious for its severity. The Bloody Code prescribed death for over 200 offenses, from murder to pickpocketing, from forgery to stealing from a shop. In theory, minor theft could lead to the gallows. In practice, various mechanisms mitigated the law's harshness. Juries often refused to convict on capital charges or deliberately undervalued stolen goods to reduce the offense to a non-capital crime. Judges could recommend mercy. Pardons were granted in many cases, often on condition of transportation to Australia. Transportation was the fate of many convicted criminals. Ships carried convicts to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, where they served out sentences of 7 years, 14 years, or life. The system provided cheap labor for the colonies while removing criminals from Britain. Conditions were harsh, and many died during the voyage or in colonial servitude. Those who were executed met their fate in public. Hanging days at Tyburn, and later at Newgate, were popular spectacles, drawing large crowds to watch the condemned die. The spectacle was intended to deter crime, but reformers questioned whether public execution actually encouraged the disorder it was meant to prevent. Prisons held those awaiting trial, debtors, and some convicted criminals. Conditions were appalling, overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden. Prisoners had to pay for their accommodations and food. Those without money suffered terribly. Prison reform was a growing cause, championed by figures like Elizabeth Fry and John Howard. The courts. The court system was complex and confusing, with different courts handling different types of cases. The great common law courts, King's Bench, Common Pleas, and Exchequer, sat in Westminster Hall, handling the most serious civil and criminal matters. The Old Bailey was the criminal court for London and Middlesex, where the most serious London crimes were tried. Below these were various local courts, magistrates' courts handling minor offenses, courts of request for small debts, and specialized tribunals for particular matters. Access to justice was expensive and often beyond the reach of ordinary people. Civil law was the province of lawyers divided into barristers and solicitors. Barristers argued cases in court, solicitors prepared cases and dealt directly with clients. The legal profession was lucrative for successful practitioners, but expensive for those who needed its services. Chapter 6: Culture, Religion, and Entertainment. The Church and Religion. The Church of England was the established church, enjoying privileges and facing obligations that made it central to national life. Bishops sat in the House of Lords. The church conducted marriages, christenings, and burials. Church attendance was expected, though not legally required. Parish churches served communities throughout London, from grand structures in wealthy neighborhoods to more modest buildings in poorer areas. The parish was a unit of local government, as well as religious organization, responsible for poor relief and other civic functions. Religious practice varied by class. The wealthy might have their own pews in fashionable churches, attending services as a social obligation as much as spiritual devotion. The middle classes took religion more seriously, often embracing the evangelical movement that was transforming English Protestantism. The poor might attend church, or might not. The established church often failed to reach the growing urban masses. Dissenting denominations, Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, Quakers, and others, maintained their own chapels and congregations. They faced legal disabilities, barred from universities, and from some public offices, but they were growing in numbers and influence. Methodism in particular appealed to the working classes, offering emotional worship and community support. Roman Catholics were a small minority, still facing legal restrictions, though these were gradually being relaxed. Irish immigration was increasing the Catholic population, and demands for Catholic emancipation would become a major political issue in the coming decades. The Jewish community maintained synagogues in the city, including the magnificent Bevis Mark Synagogue, built in 1701. Jews faced legal disabilities, but were otherwise free to practice their religion and engage in business. The theatre. London was the theatrical capital of the English-speaking world. Two great patent theatres, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, held monopolies on legitimate drama in central London, though smaller theatres evaded restrictions by presenting musical entertainments. The theatres were grand buildings seating thousands. Drury Lane, rebuilt after a fire in 1809, was one of the largest theatres in Europe. The stage was lit by oil lamps and candles. Gas lighting would soon revolutionize theatrical illumination. Audiences were boisterous, expressing their approval or disapproval vocally and sometimes violently. The repertoire mixed Shakespeare and classic plays with contemporary works. Melodrama was becoming popular, with its clear moral conflicts, exciting action, and emotional intensity. Farces and comedies entertained audiences seeking lighter fare. Stars like Sarah Siddons and John Philip Kemble drew crowds to their performances. Theater audiences included all classes, though seating was strictly segregated. Boxes held the wealthy, the pit held middle-class spectators, the galleries held the common people. Prices varied accordingly, from several shillings for boxes to a shilling or less for the galleries. Music and opera. Musical entertainments flourished in London. Opera was performed at the King's Theatre in the Haymarket, presenting Italian operas to fashionable audiences. The opera was as much a social occasion as a musical one, with boxes serving as venues for seeing and being seen. Concert halls presented orchestral and chamber music. Handel remained hugely popular, and his oratorios were performed regularly. Professional and amateur musicians performed in public venues and private homes. Music was considered an essential accomplishment for young ladies of good family. Popular music filled the streets and taverns. Ballad sellers hawked printed songs on every corner. Public houses featured musical entertainment. Pleasure gardens like Vauxhall offered concerts, along with other diversions. Music was everywhere, from the refined to the rowdy. Literature and publishing. The literary world of 1810. London was vigorous and contentious. The great Romantic poets were active: Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, and the younger generation, including Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Poetry was widely read and hotly debated. Novel reading was increasingly popular, though still considered somewhat frivolous. The Gothic novel, with its castles, mysteries, and supernatural terrors, was fashionable. Jane Austen published her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, in 1811, though her genius would not be fully recognized until later. Periodicals shaped public opinion. The Edinburgh Review and the Quarterly Review offered lengthy essays on literature, politics, and society. Newspapers reported news and commentary. The Times was emerging as the leading journal. Pamphlets debated every conceivable topic. Publishing was centered in the streets around St. Paul's Cathedral. Publishers, printers, and booksellers clustered in this area, producing everything from expensive editions of classics to cheap chapbooks for the barely literate. Lending libraries made books accessible to those who could not afford to buy them. Leisure and entertainment. Londoners of all classes found ways to enjoy their limited leisure time. The diversions available ranged from the refined to the raucous, reflecting the city's extreme social stratification. The pleasure gardens of Vauxhall and Ranelagh offered evening entertainment to respectable crowds. For an admission fee, visitors could stroll through illuminated gardens, listen to concerts, watch fireworks, and enjoy refreshments. These venues attracted people across class lines, though different areas served different clienteles. Coffee houses and taverns were essential social institutions. Coffee houses had been centers of business and political discussion since the 17th century. Taverns served all classes, from respectable establishments in good neighborhoods to rough public houses in poor areas. Clubs served the elite. White's, Brooks's, and Boodle's were the most fashionable, exclusive establishments where gentlemen could gamble, dine, and socialize. Club membership was a marker of social status, and the clubs wielded considerable influence in politics and society. Sports attracted enthusiastic participation and spectatorship. Horse racing was immensely popular, with major meetings at Epsom, Newmarket, and other courses drawing huge crowds. Boxing matches, though technically illegal, attracted spectators from all levels of society. Cricket was becoming organized, with the Marylebone Cricket Club establishing itself as the authority on the game. Gambling pervaded all levels of society. The wealthy wagered huge sums on cards, dice, and horses. The poor bet what little they had. Lotteries, both legal and illegal, offered dreams of sudden wealth. Gambling debts could ruin families, and the passion for gaming was widely criticized even as it remained widespread. Art and exhibition. The visual arts flourished in Regency London. The Royal Academy, founded in 1768, held annual exhibitions that were major social and cultural events. Thousands crowded into the Academy's rooms to view the latest works by British artists. Portrait painting remained the most reliable source of income for artists. The wealthy commissioned portraits of themselves and their families, displayed in their homes as symbols of status. Joshua Reynolds had established the grand manner in British portraiture, and his successors continued the tradition. Landscape painting was gaining prestige. Turner was already producing the luminous seascapes and landscapes that would establish him as one of Britain's greatest painters. Constable was developing his naturalistic approach to the English countryside. The British Landscape School would become one of the nation's great contributions to art. Conclusion. London in 1810 was a city of extraordinary contrasts and contradictions. It was the largest city in the world, the capital of a global empire, and the center of commerce, culture, and power, yet it was also a place of desperate poverty, disease, and crime. Its grandeur and squalor existed side by side, separated sometimes by only a street or an alley. The city was experiencing transformations that contemporaries only partly understood. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the economy, creating new wealth and new forms of work, while disrupting traditional patterns of life. Population growth was straining every system of housing, sanitation, and order. New ideas about rights, reform, and the proper ordering of society were challenging ancient assumptions. 1 million people made their lives in this city of extremes. The wealthy enjoyed comforts and luxuries that would have astonished their grandparents. The poor endured hardships that would shock later generations into reform. The middle classes navigated between these extremes, striving for security and respectability. The war with Napoleonic France overshadowed everything. It had lasted, with brief interruptions, for nearly 2 decades. It had transformed the national debt, the military establishment, and the role of government. It had also established British naval supremacy and was opening opportunities for British commerce worldwide. Religious faith remained central to most people's understanding of the world, though the nature of that faith was changing. Evangelical enthusiasm was reshaping Protestantism. Demands for Catholic emancipation were becoming insistent. Traditional assumptions about the established church's role were being questioned. Culture flourished despite, or perhaps because of, the turbulent times. The Romantic movement was reshaping literature and art. Theater entertained the masses. Music filled public venues and private homes. London was a center of intellectual and creative energy. The London of 1810 was neither the medieval city of earlier centuries nor the Victorian metropolis that would emerge later. It was a city in transition, carrying the inheritance of its long past, while being transformed by forces that would create something entirely new. The men and women who walked its streets were living through one of the great pivotal moments in urban history, though few could have predicted the changes still to come.